Good morning, class. Welcome to Chapter 4, Week 5 of Logic and Critical Thinking. So if you look here, you see that the book is divided into 5 parts, and we are completing Part 1, which ends in Chapter 4. Part 1 is entitled Connections, and then Part 2, Deductive Reasoning, which we'll be getting into next week. Part 3, Inductive Reasoning, and Part 4, Reasoning about Values, generally called Moral Philosophy. So Chapter 4, Arguments and Explanations, is that part of the first part that connects us with the rest of the chapter. So in this chapter, we will be looking at inductive reasoning in general, deductive reasoning in general, and with that, inference to the best explanation, and then also reasoning by analogy, which is somewhat straightforward and somewhat complex, meaning that it's hard to judge how effective reasoning through analogy is. It has to do with how the audience interprets the analogous connection, and that is somewhat complex to figure out. Usually just, we see the connection and it's a good analogy, or it's not a good analogy. But what makes it a good analogy is a complex question that we'll get into. This chapter also has the distinction between premises and conclusions, both implicit and explicit premises, and a syllogism, which is two premises in which a conclusion follows. So for example, Socrates is a human being. All human beings are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. And in this argument, you have two premises and a conclusion. Now there'll be implicit premises which aren't stated or made explicit, and explicit premises which are stated. This chapter provides 2 readings from the Decameron, and the first one will show you deductive reasoning. So this one individual, to get someone to pay for dinner, will try to convince other individuals that this one family is the most virtuous family. And all of the premises this individual uses you might disagree with. But deductive reasoning has this rule that if the premises are true, the conclusion will naturally follow if the argument is valid. And he does make a valid argument, and therefore the conclusion is valid if the premises were true. Now, when you're reading through this argument, you may disagree with the truth value of all of the premises. You might think, the premises aren't true. But his audience seems to accept that the premises are true. And so if they believe that the premises are true, then the conclusion, if the argument is valid, will have to follow. And in the next chapter, Chapter 5, we'll look at deductive reasoning in detail. And this is a particular form of reasoning. The next reading from the Decameron deals with reasoning through analogy. And in this story, one individual makes an analogy in order to explain his argument. I won't go into detail because it's a great story, and I want you to enjoy reading it without knowing how it turns out. But watch how analogy is used and ask yourself, well, why is analogy used here, and why might that be the best way to provide an answer to this argument? And then the last answer, or the last reading, is entitled The Daycare Deaths, a Mystery. Let me get there really quickly. That, go here. And then we have explanations. Right. And this has to do with inductive reasoning and inference to the best explanation. And the particular story that illustrates this is in one day, within a few hours of each other, two children die of sudden infant death syndrome, which is the acronym SIDS, at the same daycare on the same day. And so this has to do with inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is based on the assumption that the present and the future behaves like the past. But in order for it to work, there needs to be the past that resembled the present and the future. When the past doesn't resemble, when the future doesn't resemble the present and the past, it's hard to make inductive inferences or have inference to the best explanation. So this article or excerpt illustrates a variety of complexities that you should pay attention to when reading this article. Particularly, the first aspect of the study question says, what is SIDS? Is SIDS a good explanation of the deaths in the daycare death stories? Why or why not? And so, in a certain sense, the book asks you to question whether SIDS is an explanation for what happened, or is it just renaming what happened without providing an explanation? And this is one thing critical thinking highlights, right? Is a person providing an explanation with an answer, or is the answer just sort of a relabeling of the question, right? So during sudden infant death syndrome, is that label an answer? So this is one thing to keep in mind. And also, because in this particular situation, and I'm not sure if this has ever happened since, you had two individuals, two infants die of this on the same day at the same daycare. Statistically, it's amazingly unlikely. It's almost impossible. But logically, it's not impossible. It's just highly unlikely. So much so that perhaps the past has never supplied us with this situation before, right? So this would be, although it's a terribly negative situation, it's novel in the sense that it's a new situation. Two infants have never died at the same daycare on the same day from SIDS. And so the investigators are trying to see what happened. And they're not sure if this is an explanation, as opposed to other explanations that would make more sense. And so because the present situation at the time does not resemble any past situation, it makes inductive reasoning somewhat more difficult. And so this shows the complexity of inductive reasoning, possibly some limitations, and a general lack of certainty. But do read this article and try to ponder these questions, even if you do not select this particular study question. But I would encourage the study question. Let us go to the exercise questions. Now this, a few times during this course, I will make one exercise question mandatory. Usually I say just do the one that you want to do, that you think is most interesting or you think you can answer best. But occasionally, because we're moving to different sections, I think that one question is essential. And that question here will be exercise question 3, and it is A through, I believe, L, right? So with all of these, what I'd like you to do, so do question 3, and then put each argument in standard form, meaning the amount of premises listed in order: premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, conclusion, and also write any implicit premises. So for example, if we go down to J, he's guilty, he confessed. No argument usually just has one premise and one conclusion. There is usually an implicit premise, and a premise and a conclusion don't necessarily have to go in this order. So the conclusion would be he's guilty. A premise will be he confessed. But there's also an implicit premise in there. And so when you're doing this one, for example, you're going to write two premises. One explicit, he confessed. One implicit, whatever gets you to the conclusion that he's guilty from he confessed. Now, we also know that some people confess to things they aren't guilty of. So this might not be a valid argument, but put the argument in standard form. It might not be valid, but demonstrate the argument being made here. Sometimes the conclusion itself is implicit. If we look at F, he'll drive recklessly only if he's upset, and he's not upset. So this is, we often talk like this, where we just state premises and we assume the listener will know what the conclusion is. So so also write the conclusion here. So choose whichever study question you'd like to do, whether it be the one from the daycare death mystery story, or whether it be one of the articles from the Decameron. But for your exercise question, do this. This will be due on Friday, and on Saturday I will post an additional video, most likely a PowerPoint, in which I will write the premises and the conclusions for each one of these, going through them and allowing you to check your answers and also look through your answers as well. But have this done on Friday so that we can compare what we did. This will be quite important going forward, because when we go to chapter 5, we will be doing this almost exclusively in chapter 5, and then we'll be looking at the different argument forms in chapter 6. So we want to get used to looking at just words in sentences and in paragraphs, and breaking them up into premises and conclusions, and understanding what are implicit premises and what are explicit. Explicit are stated, implicit are implied, and then some of them are quite difficult. For example, D, for example, this is quite tough. What are they trying to say exactly? So some of them are challenging, but I look forward to your answers, and we will look at the how well you did on Saturday after you turn them in on Friday. Okay, so I hope this helps. I will also include a brief video on Hume's inquiry on concerning human understanding, to help sort of look at some of the aspects of inductive reasoning and its limitations and its fallacy, in the sense that inductive reasoning is itself based on inductive reasoning, so it's circular. All right, I hope this helps. Take care and have a good week.